When I first saw it, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But as its twisted form slithered, closer limbs contorted impossibly, feet reaching skyward, I realized this was no hallucination. It was hunting me. The parking lot was silent, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, too thick, too heavy. I was alone, or so I thought, standing under a flickering streetlight as I fumbled for my car keys. My fingers shook, a leftover effect of the late-night coffee, I told myself. But deep down I knew it. Wasn't just caffeine jitters. Something about the air felt wrong, oppressive. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, low to the ground, crawling in jerky, unnatural movements. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to face it fully. It looked like a person at first, a man, maybe, but something was horribly wrong. Its limbs bent backward at impossible angles, each movement accompanied by a nauseating, wet crack. Its feet stretched unnaturally skyward, toes pointing as if grasping for the clouds. I couldn't move. My body betrayed me, frozen as my mind screamed to get inside the car. The thing crawled closer, its head hanging unnaturally low. A noise escaped its mouth. Not quite a groan, not quite a laugh. I blinked, and it was gone. I spun around, heart hammering. The parking lot was empty, the shadows still and silent. My breath came in shallow gasps, my keys rattling in my trembling hand as I fumbled them into the lock. When I finally started the car, my headlights illuminated only the vacant lot ahead, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I pressed the accelerator harder than necessary, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever that had been. But no matter how fast I drove, the image of its twisted, backward form clung to me like a stain I couldn't scrub away. The road stretched out in front of me, empty and dark, but the silence inside the car was louder than ever. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, expecting to see that thing lurking behind me, crawling faster than anything should. The vibration of my phone startled me so badly I nearly swerved off the road. "Yeah," I answered, my voice shakier than I wanted it to be. It was my editor. "You still alive out there? Weird stuff happening in those parts." I tried to play it cool, laughing weakly. "Weird like what?" "Disappearances," she said. "Locals say people are vanishing, and all that's left behind are Beijing backward footprints." Backward footprints. The words hit me like ice water poured down my back. My grip on the steering wheel tightened, and I didn't say anything, afraid of how my voice might crack. "You okay?" she asked, her tone light, but my throat felt too tight to respond. I hung up, the phone sliding out of my hand onto the passenger seat. As if on cue, the radio hissed with static. I glanced at the dial, but the station was set to one I knew well. Then I heard it, a faint whisper threading through the white noise. "Alex. My name." I slammed my hand on the power button, shutting it off, but the silence was worse. My ears strained against the quiet, waiting for more whispers, more signs that I wasn't alone. The car felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in. My chest tightened, my breath shallow. In the rearview mirror, the empty road looked darker than it should, the shadows too thick, too alive. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew better. The dashboard flickered, the gas gauge needle hovering on empty as my car sputtered to a halt. I cursed under my breath and stepped out, the chill in the air biting my skin. The town ahead looked like a relic from a forgotten era, boarded-up windows, crumbling buildings, and a single streetlight casting elongated shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. I found the motel easily. It was the only building with a light on. Inside, the air was stale, and the man at the front desk barely acknowledged me. His cataract-clouded eyes stared somewhere past my face as he slid a key across the counter. "Room's cheap," he muttered. As I turned to leave, his voice sharpened. "Don't go wandering after dark." The room was barely habitable, wallpaper curling like dead leaves, a carpet that squelched slightly underfoot, and an old TV buzzing static. Exhaustion forced me to lie down, but sleep didn't come. Every creak of the building made my skin crawl. Then I heard it, a rhythmic tapping. It started faint, then grew louder, coming from the window. My breath hitched as I turned my head. Shadows played under the blinds, bending and shifting unnaturally. Heart pounding, I crept closer and lifted the corner of the blind. It was there. The creature crawled backward beneath the streetlight, its limbs jerking with sickening cracks. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and its head twisted unnaturally as if to see me better. I stumbled back, almost tripping, the tapping louder now. For hours I sat frozen in the corner of the room, waiting for the sound to stop. When dawn finally broke, the silence was deafening, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the thing was still out there, watching. The morning light did nothing to ease my fear. Shadows still lingered in my mind, replaying the way its body had moved. I needed answers. The town seemed deserted in the early hours. The few people I saw hurried away, their eyes darting nervously when I tried to approach. Every step I took felt heavier, as if the weight of the night's terror was still pressing on me. Finally, I found her. Marjorie lived in a sagging house at the edge of town, its yard overrun with weeds and rusting trinkets. She opened the door before I even knocked, her sharp eyes scanning me as if she already knew why I'd come. "You saw it," she said, her voice flat. It wasn't a question. I hesitated, then nodded. "You shouldn't have looked at it," she said, ushering me inside. The air in her home was thick, with the smell of herbs and something acrid I couldn't place. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely steady. She sighed and began to speak. She called them the backward ones, creatures tied to an ancient ritual gone wrong. They exist in the cracks between moments, she explained. Drawn to curiosity, to fear. Once it sees you, her voice trailed off, her expression grim. It won't stop. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as her words sank in. When I returned to my car, my blood ran cold. Backward footprints circled the vehicle, perfectly pressed into the dirt. They weren't there before. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The creature hadn't left. It had been here, walking backward around me, waiting, and it wasn't done yet. I tried to leave the town as soon as daylight broke, but something wasn't right. No matter which road I took, I ended up back at the same cracked pavement outside the gas station. My frustration boiled over, and I slammed my hands on the steering wheel. The attendant inside just stood there, smiling like he knew something I didn't. "You can't outrun it," he said when I stormed inside for answers. His voice was hollow, like he was speaking from far away. I returned to the motel, trapped and helpless. That night the tapping came back, louder, angrier. I shoved a chair against the door and dragged the dresser in front of it. But the noise didn't stop. Shadows writhed under the door, pooling and twisting like smoke. I pressed myself into the corner of the room, gripping the flashlight in my shaking hands. The light flickered, and for a moment I swore I saw fingers long, clawed fingers reaching under the door. The door. When the noise finally stopped, the silence was worse. It felt alive, oppressive. I stayed awake, unable to sleep, certain that if I closed my eyes, the creature would find a way in. By morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I returned to Marjorie, desperate for a way out. Her face was drawn, pale. "The only way to end this is to confront it," she said. She handed me a slip of paper covered in crude, looping symbols. "Go to the tree clearing," she instructed, her voice trembling. "Draw these into the dirt. But know this, it will cost you something. Something precious." The woods were silent as I approached the clearing, the trees unnaturally still. The air grew colder with every step, my breath puffing in short, white clouds. And then it came. The creature emerged from the shadows, its body grotesque and elongated. Its limbs jerked violently as it moved, its head twisting in impossible directions. When its face turned to me, I gasped. It was my face, distorted and wrong, its mouth stretching into a toothy grin. It lunged toward me, its speed defying logic, and I stumbled back, barely able to keep my footing. My heart pounded in my chest as its hollow, black eyes bore into mine, mocking me. I knew I couldn't run. Not this time. I dropped to my knees, carving the symbols into the frozen dirt with trembling hands. The creature circled me, its movements faster now, erratic and frenzied. The air felt heavier, pressing down on me like a weight. Reality began to bend. The trees swayed unnaturally, their branches clawing at the sky as, though alive. The sunlight flickered like a dying bulb, plunging the clearing into darkness and light in rapid bursts. The creature screamed, a sound that ripped through my ears like jagged glass. I forced myself to keep carving, even as my vision blurred and my chest tightened. When the last symbol was complete, the ground trembled. A void opened beneath the creature, pulling it down inch by inch. But with every inch it fell, I felt pieces of myself being pulled with it. Memories slipped through my mind like sand through my fingers, my mother's laughter, my first love, the warmth of a summer day. I tried to hold on to them, but they dissolved, leaving a hollow ache in their place. The creature let out one final, piercing wail before vanishing into the void. The clearing fell silent, but I was left with an unbearable emptiness. I knew I had survived, but I was no longer whole. I stumbled out of the clearing, the symbols still etched into the frozen dirt behind me. The world seemed quieter now, too quiet. The oppressive weight in the air had lifted, but something felt wrong, missing. My mind felt hollow, stripped of pieces I couldn't name. I drove until the woods were far behind, the road stretching endlessly under a dull gray sky. The town faded from my mirrors, but the feeling didn't leave me. My chest ached with an emptiness I couldn't explain, a nagging sense that something precious had been stolen. That night I locked every door, drew every curtain, and tried to convince myself it was over. The tapping came anyway, but it was faint at first, like the tick of a distant clock. Then it grew louder, closer, until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. My breath caught as I turned toward the mirror. My reflection stared back. At first it was just me, gaunt and exhausted. But then it smiled too, wide. Its mouth stretched unnaturally, splitting into jagged teeth. And when it moved, my body didn't follow. "Are you sure it's over?" it whispered. The lights flickered. I haven't stopped looking over my shoulder since. If you dare, share this story. But remember, every retelling brings it closer. Are you alone as you finish this? Or is something watching from behind? The first time I heard it, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But when I saw its distorted body and the way it screamed seemed to pull reality inside out, I realized running might not save me. It wasn't just chasing me, it wanted to pull me into its reverse nightmare. The night felt wrong before it even began. A biting wind tore through the park, bending trees that normally stood tall and still. The gravel path crunched beneath my boots, each step echoing, unnaturally loud in the eerie silence. I told myself it was just late, that the emptiness around me was normal. But when the scream came, all logic vanished. It started faintly, almost like a breath of wind pulling through hollow pipes. Then it grew louder, warping and twisting as though someone had grabbed the edges of a sound and forced it backward. The scream wasn't just unnatural, it felt alive, buzzing through my chest and making my skin crawl. My breath hitched, and I froze mid-step. My eyes darted to the trees lining the path, their shadows stretching unnervingly far in the dim light of the park's broken lamps. Nothing moved, but the scream came again, this time sharper, closer. My instincts screamed louder than the sound run. I turned and sprinted, heart pounding against my ribs. By the time I reached my apartment door, I was gasping, the cold air burning my throat. Inside, I slammed the door shut and bolted every lock. The sound of my own breathing was deafening. But the scream didn't follow me. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting, trembling, but silence settled like a shroud. I convinced myself it was a prank, or maybe some animal. Deep down, though, I knew I'd heard something unnatural, something wrong. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, unable to close my eyes. My rational mind fought to explain it, but my gut knew the truth. The scream wasn't finished. With me. With me. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the old apartment felt amplified. Every gust of wind against the windows made my heart race. The scream kept playing in my head, warping and looping until it felt like it was clawing at the edges of my sanity. When morning finally came, it brought no relief. Pulling open the curtains, I froze. Deep scratches marred the glass of my bedroom window. They were jagged and uneven, as if made by claws too large for any animal I could imagine. My apartment was on the second floor. I pressed my palm against the cool glass, measuring the height. Whatever had made the scratches had to be unnaturally tall or capable of climbing. I told myself it must have been a tree branch blown by the wind, even though there were no trees near the window. The explanation didn't hold, but it was better than admitting the alternative. Oh. That night, the scream returned. I'd barely turned off the lights when it began, louder this time. It was as if the walls of my apartment amplified it, each guttural note vibrating in my chest. Covered my ears. But it didn't help. The sound wasn't just around me, it was inside me. It didn't stop. I could feel my heart thudding wildly, panic rising in my throat. I was frozen in place, too scared to move. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the scream stopped. Silence flooded the room. But it wasn't a comforting silence. It was heavy, oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I stayed awake the rest of the night, flinching at every sound. When morning came, I felt safer. Something wasn't just haunting me, it was hunting me. A week passed, but the scream never left me. It came nearly every night, louder, closer, dragging me further into dread. My reflection in the bathroom mirror told the story's sunken eyes, pale skin, and trembling hands that refused to stay still. I was unraveling. Then, one night, I saw it. The scream started as I walked home from work, louder than I'd ever heard it before. My chest tightened, my legs ready to bolt, but a movement in the shadows stopped me cold. At first it was just a flicker, a figure that seemed too tall, its proportions all wrong. Then it stepped into the light. The creature's body was a grotesque mockery of humanity, its limbs bent at unnatural angles, its joints cracking with every movement, its head tilted to the side, as if broken, and its face. Its face was a hollow void, where eyes and a mouth should have been. I couldn't breathe. My legs finally obeyed, and I ran. The scream followed, louder with every step, warping the air around me. When I risked a glance over my shoulder, it was chasing me, not running, but jerking forward in short, unnatural bursts. Its head snapped toward me, and for a moment, I thought it smiled. I reached my apartment, throwing myself inside and slamming the door. My shaking hands fumbled with the locks as the scream reached a deafening pitch outside. Then, just as before, it stopped. I sat on the floor, clutching my knees, trying to catch my breath. The room was silent again, but I knew it was out there somewhere, waiting, watching. It had seen me now, and I had no doubt it would be back. I couldn't keep living like this, jumping at shadows, flinching at every sound. The scream haunted me even in the rare moments it didn't actually occur. I needed answers. Somewhere. Someone had to know what I was dealing with. The library was empty when I arrived. Rows of old wooden shelves loomed in silence, their contents dusty and forgotten. I started with the newspaper archives, scrolling through microfilm with trembling hands. That's when I found an article from 1974. The headline read, "Third, disappearance linked to midnight screams." My stomach tightened as I read. The article detailed a series of vanishings, all of them following. Reports of strange, reversed screams echoing through the town. Witnesses described distorted shadows and an unshakable sense of being watched. The details mirrored my own experience, too closely to dismiss. I barely noticed the librarian until her voice startled me. "You shouldn't be digging into that," she said, her face pale beneath the fluorescent lights. Her name tag read Mrs. Grayson, and her eyes were filled with unease. When I pressed her, she hesitated, but something in her gaze softened. "We used to call it the," echoed one, she whispered, glancing nervously around as though it might be listening. "It's no ghost. It's older, cursed, born of hatred and grief. It pulls people into its world, feeds on their fear, and leaves nothing behind." Her words sent chills down my spine. I asked what it wanted, why it was following me. Her voice dropped lower. "It picks people who notice it. Fear keeps it alive. But the more you resist, the harder it tries." She grabbed my arm as I stood to leave, her grip surprisingly strong. "Leave town," she urged, "before it drags you into its nightmare." But I couldn't leave. Not when I knew it wasn't just the town it was haunting, it was me. I couldn't shake Mrs. Grayson's warning. Her words echoed in my mind as I tried to return to normal life. But normal was no longer an option. It started. Small objects in my apartment shifted position when I looked away. A cup I'd placed on the counter now on the floor. A door I'd locked swinging open without a sound. I tried to dismiss it as stress. Then, time itself began to twist. One morning, I spilled coffee all over the table, cursing under my breath as I grabbed a towel. But when I turned back, the coffee was in the mug again, as though it had never spilled. My heart raced. I reached for the mug, and this time I watched as the liquid rippled and sucked itself back into place, defying logic. The worst part wasn't the impossibility of it, it was the certainty that it wasn't random. It was the creature. It was warping the world around me, bending reality like I was some kind of plaything. That night, someone knocked on my door. My stomach dropped. No one ever visited me. I opened it to find a man, disheveled and trembling. "You're not safe," he said without preamble, his eyes darting to the shadows behind him. His name was Matthew. He told me he'd been stalked by the same creature years ago. His memories were fractured, his life in ruins. "It's pulling you in," he said. "It doesn't just want you. Afraid it wants you gone." He handed me a small mirror. "This might help. It's not a weapon, but it'll confuse it. Buy you time." I clutched the mirror tightly. The weight of his words crushed me. Time was running out, and I knew I couldn't run forever. I didn't sleep that night. Matthew's words circled in my mind like a storm, his gift, the mirror, feeling cold and heavy in my hand. I had no idea how it worked or if it even could. But the scream returned that night, louder and closer than ever, as though the creature knew I was trying to resist. I couldn't keep running. I had to face it. The thought terrified me, but the alternative was unthinkable, spending every waking moment in its shadow, waiting for it to finally catch me. I returned to the park where it all began. The air was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. I held the mirror tightly, my knuckles white. Then the scream started. It was deafening, louder than ever before. My body locked up as the creature emerged from the shadows. This time it didn't hold back. Its full form was grotesque, twisted limbs moving in unnatural bursts. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a void, hollow and endless. Its scream warped the space around it, twisting the trees, the stars, everything. I held up the mirror as it charged, and for a moment the creature stopped. The scream faltered, twisting into something weaker, almost like a gasp. It tilted its head, its hollow gaze fixated on its own reflection. The air grew thick, buzzing with some kind of energy I couldn't understand. I didn't wait to find out what it meant. I turned and ran, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. When I reached my apartment, I slammed the door shut, my heart hammering in my chest. The scream didn't follow, but I knew it wasn't over. Something about the way it looked at its reflection left a mark, not just on it but on me. I thought I was free. After the creature disappeared in the park, life was quiet. Too quiet. The absence of its scream should have been a relief, but the silence felt unnatural, suffocating as though something still lingered in the air around me. It started small. Time felt slippery, unreliable. Some days seemed to stretch endlessly, the minutes dragging by like molasses. Other days vanished in a blur, their moments out of order. One night I walked into my kitchen to make dinner and realized the clock had skipped back 3 hours. My hands trembled as I watched the second hand jerk backward and stop entirely. People around me began acting strangely. A neighbor I had known for years glanced at me as if I were a stranger. My boss gave me a blank stare when I said hello, as though my presence startled him. Even my reflection in the mirror seemed off. The face staring back felt hollow, unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone else entirely. Then, late one night, I heard it again, the scream. Faint at first, as if it were coming from far away, but unmistakable. The sound crawled up my spine like cold fingers. I sat frozen in my bed, gripping the blankets tightly. Slowly, the scream grew louder, until it felt like it was inside the walls. I turned to the mirror across the room, hoping to ground myself. Instead, my heart nearly stopped. There, behind my reflection, stood the creature. Its hollow eyes were locked on me, its gaping mouth unmoving. But the reversed scream still echoed in my ears. I spun around, but the room was empty. When I looked back, the mirror was cracked, shards missing where its face had been. I knew then that I hadn't escaped. It wasn't chasing me anymore, it was inside me. I began waking up in strange places. One moment, I would be in my apartment, lying in bed. Next, I'd open my eyes to find myself in a warped, twisted version of the park. Trees bent at impossible angles, their shadows shifting and curling like living things. The air was heavy, filled with the faint hum of reversed whispers. And always, in the distance, was the scream. It wasn't just a dream. I could feel the damp grass under my feet, the cold wind biting at my skin. I would stumble through the distorted landscape, looking for a way out, only to wake up back in my bed, gasping for air. Each time I felt more drained, more disconnected from the real world. These shifts began happening during the day too. I'd blink, and suddenly I'd be standing in an unfamiliar version of my apartment. The walls would ripple as though they were breathing, and the clock on the wall would run backward in bursts. My phone refused to work, the numbers on, the screen jumbling and twisting into nonsense. The worst was the feeling of being watched. I could sense the creature lurking, just beyond my vision. Its shadow flickered in the corners of the room, its scream always faint but constant. Knew it was toying with me, pulling me deeper into its world. I started keeping a notebook, desperately mapping the shifts to find some kind of pattern, but nothing made sense. The rules of time and space no longer applied. Every time I thought I had escaped, I'd find myself right back where I started, the creature's presence growing stronger. I realized I wasn't just haunted. I was trapped in its dimension, and each shift brought me closer to becoming part of it. Desperation led me back to the library, though I knew the answers I sought would terrify me. Mrs. Grayson wasn't there this time. I sat alone in the dim archives, poring over ancient records and forgotten legends. That's when I found it a journal written by a local man in the 1800s. Words were frantic, fragmented, as if he had been losing his mind. He described a figure that stalked him, its screams ripping through the fabric of reality. The creature, he wrote, had once been human. It was a victim of betrayal, cursed to exist outside of time. Its screams weren't just to terrify, they were a warning. A cry for help trapped in reverse. It doesn't want to hurt you, he scrawled. It wants to be free. The words shook me to my core. Was it possible that the creature's torment mirrored my own? That it wasn't just a predator, but something far more tragic? The idea of confronting it again filled me with dread, but I couldn't ignore the possibility that helping it might save me. I returned to the park that night, the journal clutched in my hand. The scream began almost immediately, louder and more urgent than ever. The creature emerged from the shadows, its distorted body trembling with raw, unnatural energy. But this time, I didn't run. "I know who you are," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The creature paused, its hollow, eyes locking onto mine. Images flashed in my mind its life before the curse, a betrayal that left it broken and angry. I reached out, not knowing if it would attack or listen. In that moment, I saw the truth. Freeing it would mean sacrificing a part of myself. And yet, I couldn't turn away. The creature stepped closer, its scream twisting into something almost human. The air pressed against me like a weight I couldn't lift. My lungs burned with each shallow breath, as though the air itself was poisonous. The creature stood only a few feet away, its misshapen body convulsing like it was barely holding itself together. Its hollow eyes bore into me, and the strange, reversed wail that emanated from its gaping mouth seemed quieter now, almost deliberate, like it was testing me. Waiting. I felt the pull, the invisible thread binding me to this thing, growing taut. It wasn't physical, but it was there, tugging at my very essence, demanding I come closer. My legs felt rooted to the ground, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I couldn't. Not this time. "You don't have to do this," I said, my voice trembling. I didn't know if the words were meant to placate the creature or convince myself. It didn't respond, not directly, but its head tilted in that sharp, unnatural way, its neck cracking as though the joints were made of dry wood. The sound made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to hold my ground. A flood of images slammed into my mind. They weren't mine, but they felt real, vivid, like stolen memories forced into my head. A human face, once normal, even kind, stared back at me, twisted by betrayal and anguish. The creature had been someone once. I saw glimpses of its life, flashes of a story that had ended in unimaginable suffering. Its humanity had been stripped away, leaving behind this hollow, monstrous shell. I could feel its torment now, like a lead weight in my chest. It wasn't just feeding on fear, it was trapped by it. The creature stepped closer, its jerky, spasmodic movements more aggressive now, as if it had decided I wasn't going to run. My legs trembled, but I stood my ground. I knew I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't hide. The only way out was through. "If it ends this, take me," I whispered, the words catching in my throat like shards of glass. They tasted wrong, but they were the truth. My body tensed as I waited for it to strike, my heart racing so fast it felt like it might burst. The creature stopped. Its scream shifted, breaking apart into something raw and guttural. It was almost human, almost mournful. Then it lunged. Its limbs jerked with impossible speed, and I braced for the impact, shutting my eyes tightly. Instead of pain, I felt the world around me dissolve. My stomach dropped as though I were falling, and when I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the park. I was standing in a void, an infinite blackness, where nothing existed but me. The silence was deafening. No reversed screams, no wind, no heartbeat. Just nothing. Time slipped away from me, seconds stretching into eternity, then collapsing into nothingness again. I tried to think of my name, my home, the life I'd led before this, but the memories crumbled like ash in my hands. The harder I tried to hold on to them, the faster they slipped away. My identity dissolved, piece by piece, until I was nothing more than a hollow presence adrift in the void. And then I saw it. The creature wasn't in front of me anymore. It was inside me. My reflection appeared in the thought, dark, faint at first, then more vivid, as though etched into the void itself. But the face staring back wasn't entirely mine. Its eyes were hollow, its expression vacant, as though it were looking through me rather than at me. The scream returned not loud but faint, coiling inside me, twisting in my chest like a viper ready to strike. I realized then what had happened. I hadn't stopped it. I hadn't escaped. I had become it. When I woke, I was back in the park. The air was warm, the trees stood tall, and the night was deathly still. At first I thought I'd imagined it all. The void, the creature, the screams. It could have been a nightmare, couldn't it? But the quiet wasn't comforting. It felt unnatural, as though something had been stripped from the world, leaving it hollow. I stumbled out of the park, my legs weak beneath me. The streets were empty, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, and yet I felt unseen. As I walked, people passed me, their faces turned away, their eyes sliding over me like I wasn't there. I called out to one of them, a man in a gray coat, but he didn't even flinch. My voice sounded strange in my ears, distant and distorted, like it was being played backward. Panic bubbled in my chest, but I couldn't bring myself to shout. Again. It was pointless. When I finally made it back to my apartment, everything was exactly as I had left it. Except for the mirror. It was cracked, just like before. My reflection stared back, but it wasn't me. The eyes were too dark, the expression too empty. Something was wrong. I stepped closer, my breath fogging the fractured glass, and froze. Behind my reflection, I saw the creature. Its hollow gaze burned into mine, its mouth hanging open in a silent scream. I spun around, expecting it to be there, but the room was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, the cracks had spread further, the shards barely clinging to the frame. And in those shards I saw its eyes, its mouth, its endless hunger. I backed away slowly, but I knew it didn't matter. It wasn't chasing me anymore. It didn't have to. The screams were inside me now, coiled tightly, waiting to escape. If you dare, share this story. But remember, every retelling brings it closer to reality. Are you sure you're alone as you finish this story? Or is something already watching? From the shadows?